This is a Momentum Media production.
Welcome to the Smart Property Investment Show, the podcast by investors for investors.
Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of the Smart Property Investment Show. I'm your host for this installment, Juliet Helmke. I'm part of the team that brings you all the news over on SPI. And today I'm joined by Orana Durney-Benson, one of our illustrious journalists who has been hard at work covering everything that's happening in the property sector. Orana, thank you so much for joining us today and for coming into the studio to have this fun chat.
Yeah, it's great to be behind the mic at last. It's been so long.
It has been a bit of a while. We are well overdue for an editorial update. And because there has been so much going on, that is what we are going to be bringing you today. One of the biggest stories to come out of just this recent week is the news that Brisbane has leapfrogged, at least for now, Melbourne to become the second most expensive city in Australia after Sydney. Now, Orana, you covered this, and it's quite interesting because some of it is a bit of a technicality, but overall it is an instance where all the interest in Brisbane has really propelled some of those prices of property beyond what's happening down in Melbourne, which is typically the second most expensive city after Sydney. So tell us about what has shifted recently in the market down there. So tell us what has shifted recently in that market in Brisbane as well as sort of Melbourne, because that is kind of what we're comparing it to, and what that means on a national scale.
Yeah, I mean, it's news that 10 years ago no one would have seen coming. Brisbane was always one of the cheaper East Coast cities, but that's, no longer. Earlier in January, that's when the news first came out that Brisbane's median dwelling value had overtaken Melbourne's. But at that point, it was more for technicality reasons. Melbourne was flush with new build apartments that were going for fairly cheap prices. And so the composition of Melbourne's market with a greater proportion of cheap units was one of the reasons why the median price is down. But now houses in Brisbane are more expensive than houses in Melbourne as well. So yeah, it's only a $190 difference, so it's not too much, but I think it's still a big moment for Brisbane, which is usually going to be coming after Melbourne, and also Canberra is usually one of the second most expensive cities.
It's true. We see that sort of shifting taking place. It's been Melbourne a lot of the time. Canberra has also been in the mix, but it really was interesting earlier in the year to see Brisbane pop up. Though, as you say, it was a lot of the discussion around it was about the fact that the different property types that were selling in these various locations had a large impact on how the data was coming across. And so at the start of the year, it wasn't necessarily heralded as sort of like Brisbane's become this sort of, this spot for expensive property in Australia. But now we're seeing that narrative change a little bit. We are noticing that house price, which is significant, that has come up. Queensland has often been a spot of interest, the state in general, for people over the past couple of years as they've been looking to kind of lifestyle locations where there might be a little bit more affordability. And it's just really interesting to see that while affordability has kind of driven some of that interest, it has actually then changed the affordability story. Would you agree that that's kind of a correct way of putting it?
Yeah, absolutely. And these changes have only happened in the last 4 or 5 years. One of the biggest difference between Melbourne and Canberra and Brisbane's markets is the rate of growth since the COVID pandemic. So in that time, since COVID started, the median dwelling value in Brisbane has increased 59.8%.
Wow.
That's almost a 60% increase in the median house price in just 4 or 5 years. In contrast, the house price in Melbourne has just grown slightly over 11%. So it's as much to do with the rate of growth as anything else. And the economists out there are mostly putting that down to extremely low supply in Brisbane. That's the story everywhere in Australia, but in Brisbane especially, there are just not enough homes to go around for all the people that need them.
Yeah, and that demand, as we've been saying, it really has come up in Brisbane and across sort of southeast Queensland. As you say, though, Orana, the margin is fairly slim at this point in time, and while Brisbane is on a higher growth trajectory, we will certainly be keeping an eye on those movements to see if there's a little bit of a tug of war happening between those cities. Canberra, of course, we can't forget, gets a look in there as well. And we will be bringing you all the news on that. We will be discussing more about sort of how migration trends are impacting various Australian markets when we come back after a quick break. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to this very special editorial update. I'm speaking with Orana Durney-Benson. And before the break, we were discussing the fact that Brisbane has become the second most expensive city in Australia, which represents a bit of a change in how things are normally seen among the major capitals, with that spot usually being taken by Melbourne or Canberra. Now, the interesting thing that we were discussing here is that part of what has made Brisbane such a popular place for people to be looking for a home or investment property is its traditional view as something of a more affordable city on the East Coast. And look, the plain fact is that we are seeing a lot of migration, a lot of property interest driven by these affordability factors. And so while Brisbane now perhaps won't be having that pull as, an affordable place to go and buy a home, what we are seeing is that across the country, people have their eyes on those locations. And what that's meaning for a lot of people seeking more affordability is that they're being drawn more and more to the regions. Now, we just had a new report come out from the Regional Australia Institute, which publishes the Regional Movers Index in collaboration with the Commonwealth Bank. And what they found is that regional migration, so sort of the flow from the cities into smaller metropolitan areas and into country areas, country towns, those sort of things, is at one of its highest peaks since we saw that big regional migration during the COVID pandemic. So all those people who were saying, it's just a blip, it's really because of remote work and COVID has allowed people to do that, but it's going backwards and we're going to see everything flowing back into the cities. Regional Australia Institute is now saying not so fast. What we're seeing is that level of affordability is really driving a lot of people's decisions on where they want to live and where they want to buy and where they want to invest as well. So what we've seen is that for the 3 months to March, the number of city dwellers choosing to leave major metropolitan centers is at the highest it has been in 12 months. On top of that, this is the 5th biggest quarter of influx from city slickers leaving their big cities, the Sydney, the Melbourne, all of that sort of thing. It's the 5th biggest quarter of influx in the last 6 years.
Wow.
So that is significant. And Orana, I'd love to get your read on how you see sort of this affordability particularly playing into some of those hotspots that we talk about. Obviously, Southeast Queensland has been a really big one, but with Brisbane being a little bit out of the picture, you see spots like, for example, the Gold Coast becoming quite popular. In New South Wales, where we are actually broadcasting from, we're seeing Newcastles, Wollongongs, those sorts of cities really coming up in the spots that people are looking to settle down in. What's your take on what's happening in migration right now? What do you think is a big part of the driver that's pushing people towards those kind of smaller cities in general?
Yeah, during COVID, it was lifestyle factors, it was working from home becoming more prominent, but this time around, it's affordability. And that's the key to everyone's movement this time. Yeah, we'll see people moving to Sunshine Coast, to Geelong, places which are often within commuting distance, within occasional commuting distance of major work centres.
Absolutely.
Or alternatively to those smaller regional centres where there is good work available as well. But people are simply being priced out of cities. Whether you're renting, whether you're buying, interest rates are affecting us all. And the cost of living, that's the topic on everyone's lips at the moment.
It certainly is. Yeah, and what has also been quite interesting in that data is that a big generation to be leading that charge are millennials. So people who are in this kind of prime first home buyer cohort, really. And in some ways, you might think, it's not unsurprising looking to sort of buy your first home, or in that stage of life where many people are potentially looking to start a family or raising a young family, where those costs of living are, really can lead to very small margins on the balance sheet. But it's interesting because, the argument can also be made for retirees or for people who are, raising teens or who have just had kids flown the nest and they're looking to change their living situation. And it's not so much. It really is driving this millennial cohort, those people who are in that first home buyer bracket. And we've seen another report recently that talks about first home buyers and how they are really driving a certain trend. Orana, that's something you covered for us. Do you want to delve into that?
Yeah, what's interesting in terms of first home buyer trends at the moment is, first of all, the enthusiasm that's still there for home ownership. We have a lot of scare campaigns, might be a strong word. We have a lot of anxiety about affording home ownership at the moment. It's something that's often seen as unachievable for a lot of young Australians. But those millennials, people who are now in their 30s, maybe their early 40s, who are looking to buy a home for the first time, are countering market trends, and they are still willing to participate in the market. And that's something we've actually been seeing increases this year compared to last year.
Right, with that loan data flowing down to show that they are really leading the charge in terms of new loans that are being taken out.
Absolutely.
And I think that's so interesting. We've had some insight from the industry recently talking about particularly the kind of homes that they're looking at. And that's interesting, from many perspectives, but particularly because if they're the sort of biggest home-seeking cohort in terms of purchasing property, it also puts pressure on a certain part of the market and has the potential to drive prices even more in those subsectors. So tell us, what kind of homes is the first home buyer cohort sort of looking at specifically?
Yeah, I think stereotypically the idea of a first home is like a smaller home, potentially a unit or something like that. But what we're seeing, particularly in outer suburban locations of major capital cities like Sydney and Melbourne, is that first home buyers in that millennial generation are looking for detached family-size homes. They like new builds, ideally no more than 10 years old, and houses with 3 to 4 bedrooms, so it's something that you can grow into. And those are becoming most popular, but that's obviously putting a lot of pressure on supply, which is still limited given the challenges that the constructor sector is facing. If you want new homes and if construction has been halted since the pandemic, there aren't that many available in those locations.
It's true. So we are seeing the pressure on prices there. Now, that's sort of something we're going to jump back into after a quick break. Stay with us. We'll be back soon. Welcome back, everyone, to this editorial update where I'm speaking with Orana Durney-Benson. Now, before the break, we were talking about first home buyer preferences and the types of properties they are looking at. Orana, you shared the really interesting information that a lot of what they're wanting are these homes in the 10-year kind of construction bracket. So not too much older than that. And I think what's really interesting about that is we're having a lot of conversations at the moment about how homes are working for the people, particularly who live in them and who own them. And what I mean by that is their energy efficiency. Now, part of what is attracting first home buyers to these newer properties is simply the fact that, well, there's a lot of things they don't have to do to them, a lot of renovations, but they often don't have to look at things like insulation, draft proofing, all that stuff that older homes are really falling down in. Energy costs are something that Australians are talking about a lot. We've seen the federal government trying to tackle that with some energy rebates to be flowing down this year. But another initiative that they've recently announced, which certainly impacts homeowners, is this low-cost loan that is being facilitated through the lender Plenty to allow Australians to make energy-saving updates to their home. In particular, they're talking about rooftop solar and purchasing battery storage for those systems. Now, this doesn't take the price of buying those systems down. It actually doesn't even, sort of stop people from needing to pay interest on them. But it does mean that a loan to do something like that is a lot more affordable because we know that these are huge costs and they're things that people are prioritizing in this high energy cost environment. So I think that's really interesting. That's something that we've been talking about a lot. And it's interesting to see how potentially this sort of like energy efficiency, the desire to have a home that doesn't need a whole lot of more work is impacting people in that first home buyer sort of cohort. Another thing that we've seen recently, speaking of energy costs, is down in Victoria. Now, so the state has just announced that it is mulling some mandates for energy efficiency in rentals. And this is all about retrofitting, particularly older properties that don't have the insulation, the draft proofing, the heating and cooling to make these homes comfortable. And it's something that we're talking about more and more because of the fact that energy prices are high. But we've also seen data recently saying, like Australia is ranked one of the countries with the coldest homes, despite being regarded as a warm climate. I think the World Health Organization has recently talked, it had Australia on that list saying where houses are below, fact check me on this, I believe it was 16 degrees.
Yeah. Average of 12 or 11 degrees internally in most Australian homes.
That is just simply too cold for people. And we know, Victoria being one of the southern states, they're now saying we've got to take this seriously because it particularly is when you're a renter, when you have less control over what you can do to a home to bring those energy costs down. So it's something really interesting that we're going to be paying attention to. And we also know that the Real Estate Institute of Victoria is going to be paying attention. And in fact, they're going to be consulting on the process. They've talked about how they support this measure. And we can see why, because it is so important. You don't want renters having demonstrably less comfortable homes because they lack that control over them. But what REIV has said is that they want to make sure that anything new that's brought in strikes a balance and doesn't put any more of too much of a cost burden onto investors, because we know with rentals being really tight, the last thing that we want to happen is investors fleeing the market en masse and finding that we have fewer rentals available for people, because that also just pushes prices up. It means that people are paying more money for lower quality, and we don't want to see that happen. So it's a bit of a thorny issue, and I think it's something that we care a lot about and that we will be following to make sure that we're bringing you all the news and that you know what's happening in this sector, whether it be from a property professional or an investor or just a renter or a homeowner yourself. What exists out there to make sure that you can make your homes comfortable and to make sure that you are getting the best and most comfortable home if you're a renter, and that you're fulfilling your obligations if you are a landlord or a property manager in some capacity like that.
Absolutely. We see that these changes are going to be coming out across the commercial sector in terms of net zero transitions and energy efficiency. And it's something that also clearly is affecting people on a residential scale as well. It's going to be interesting to see how things play out over the months to come, whether other states may follow in their footsteps, whether it's going to stay a Victorian thing, and how this is going to affect the industry on a broader scale.
Absolutely. We will be keeping a close eye on all of that, as you say, Orana, particularly as our net zero goals draw near. We know that property plays a big role in allowing companies being able to make their net zero goals, for the nation in general to be able to reduce those carbon emissions. We need to be looking at property. So we will be talking about that a lot more in future, I know. That's about all we have time for. Orana, thank you so much for sitting down and having a chat today and going over some of the big things that we will be keeping an eye on.
Absolutely. It's been so good.
Thank you, everybody, for listening in. We hope you enjoyed this editorial update episode. If you did, please like or review us on whatever platform you're using to listen in on. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out at editor@smartpropertyinvestment.com.au. Stay up to date with the latest on our website and subscribe at smartpropertyinvestment.com.au. And be sure to check us out on social media, Facebook, X, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Thank you for listening. We'll be back soon with another episode of the Smart Property Investment Show. Until then, goodbye.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property, or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.
Feeling trapped by rising interest payments? Escape from mortgage prison with expert refinancing assistance from Finny. We have helped hundreds of borrowers break free from higher loan repayments by finding a more suitable loan. Our expert team can quickly assess your situation, and if there's a better lender available, we'll find it fast. Don't delay, call today. Speak to a Finny mortgage specialist on 02 8866 2444 or visit our website at www.finny.com.au.